thanks very much indeed, and apologies for not being able to join you in person. I hope we get invited back again for future summits, and thanks very much to the Physiological Society and I think Wellcome Trust as well for all the support for this. So I'm new in this role. I was the chief scientist at WHO until a few weeks ago. But I have actually, in the transition from my past life at Wellcome and to my new life at WHO, have been very involved in with colleagues here on the whole climate and health agenda. And I look forward to taking it forward in the future now as having direct responsibility of this at WHO. And I don't think there can be a more important time, frankly, for the Physiological Society to be hosting this meeting. Obviously, the world is going through a period of really remarkable disruption at the moment. We obviously feel that hugely within WHO with the changes from a number of countries, not just one, in their continued support for multilateralism. And I think the whole structure and system of the multilateral system is being challenged at the moment. And we should be honest about that. And we must think through very carefully what our collective response to that is going to be. And at the forefront of that, in a way, is the debate, which remarkably is still going on about climate. And we cannot be passive in this debate. We are all collectively going to have to lean into it even more than we perhaps have thought necessarily over the last few years. You could argue what the great challenges of the 21st century are going to be. I would include inequality, access to energy and clean water, obviously continued, convergence of non-communicable diseases and the continued threat of infectious diseases. But climate lies at the heart of many of those great challenges. And I would argue as a public health and clinician and scientist that perhaps we have not put health and science, and I'll come back to that, enough at the heart of the climate agenda. And I think that's not a criticism for our climate community colleagues at all, but I think it is very difficult to make the case across the public and the communities about climate change that is framed in what might happen at the end of this century. And I do believe as a universal truth that everybody does care about their health, and therefore putting health, and not just health at the end of the century, but health impacts of the climate change that is happening today at the heart of the climate debate. The analogy I make often is with smoking. It sometimes has historically been difficult to persuade teenagers and early adults to not smoke for a perceived benefit now in peer pressure or whatever, against a negative consequence in 10, 20, or 30 years' time with all of the diseases associated with smoking. We have to bring the health agenda to the heart of the climate agenda. Climate change is a health crisis above all, and it's a health crisis affecting people today. The other issue, and the Physiological Society I think needs to take and could take a lead on this, is around the science agenda within the climate. And there is the fierce urgency of now in the climate situation. But the climate change, we all have to appreciate, is going to some degree happen. And therefore, understanding the science behind that climate change and its impact on physiology and on humans and animals and agriculture is absolutely fundamental. This issue is not going to go away. And therefore, whilst I do make the case of the fierce urgency of now, and we haven't got time to just do everything and wait 5, 10, 20 years' time. Nevertheless, the continued investment in discovery and basic science and understanding of mechanisms by how extreme heat or climate change more generally, or indeed other environmental factors of pollution and others are going to influence our and animals' physiology is absolutely critical, because with the best will in the world, this is not going to go away and all be solved, and we are going to continue to face the challenges of the impact of climate on heat, on all of our bodies and on those in the animal sector as well. So I would encourage us, whilst dealing with the first fierce urgency of today, making sure that we don't think that we shouldn't continue to invest in understanding basic and discovery science in order to address the challenges of tomorrow as well. I think it's entirely possible to do both. And I think it's critical we do. The other area which I think is so important for the scientific community to fully engage in that is, number one, because science contributes to global warming and climate change. And we must do as a sector all we can to make sure that we put our own house in order before we take on other agendas that may be arguing in a different direction. We need to make sure we're leaders in this. And that means seeing how laboratories, how scientific endeavors adapt, how data and data centers adapt in the future to make sure that they are also carbon neutral and net zero over the coming years. So we have to put our own house in order, and that's why scientific engagement in this is so important. But the other is because whilst trust is challenged in science at the moment, if you look at the Edelman Trust Index that's published every January, nevertheless, scientists continue to have a pretty high level of trust in society. And therefore, the voice of science is very important in feeding into government policy, in engaging with communities and the public, and making sure that the case for evidence-based science in our policy making is crucial. And for that, it also means that scientists have to engage in policy. We do need scientifically literate policymakers, but we also need policy literate scientists. And it is not a dead-end career, and I say this personal bias, of course. It isn't the end of a scientific career if one chooses to so-called leave science to play a role in policy making. And if we do not engage in the policy debates as scientists, then we cannot complain when policy doesn't necessarily follow the best evidence. So I think the engagement of scientists, the Physiological Society, in the political and policy debates is crucial, and for people to feel that as scientists we have a role in those policy debates. There's one last bit of networking that I would like to encourage, and I can follow up online with anybody interested. In April of this year, I attended an EMBO conference which tried to pull together cell biologists led by EMBO in Lisbon, Portugal. And I would like, if it's possible, and take it offline, to link up this conversation at this summit with that summit as well, because I think the more we can come together and network and act as a total community, the more powerful and more influential we'll be, and bringing people together in this fragmented world is ever more important, not just in the so-called global north, but increasingly critically also in the whole world. And I think science has a crucial role to play in networking, bringing people together across that inequitable north-south divide. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes if it's helpful and of interest, and happy to take any challenge or criticisms or challenge questions of what I've said. But WHO will remain at the heart of the climate and health agenda, and anything we can do to support this summit going forward and the work of the Physiological Society and indeed Wellcome Trust, we will be delighted to do so. So full support from this side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So does anybody have any questions? If you do, could you raise your hand? So do we have a mic here with the gentleman with his hand up?
Hi there. Thank you so much for laying out that. I'm Kush. I'm an infection doctor working in London. I think so many of the issues that you've described, really at the root of them is the economic system that prioritizes growth and profit above like prioritizing health goals. And I totally take on board your desire for there to be more like policy aware scientists to bridge that gap. But I think where we often as health focused scientists fall down on is making that economic argument. And we will say, well, we need more money for investment in this health solution, but then the politicians will come back while saying, oh, but you know, that what will that do for the economy? We don't have the funding for it. Like, how best do you think we can actually bridge that gap? And do you think it's the place for health-based scientists and like, you know, clinicians to be making a call really for an economic revolution to refocus what our goals should be?
Yeah, the problem with many of these debates is you come to a fierce agreement, and the question is, what do you do about it after you've reached that consensus agreement, which in itself is sometimes dangerous. So my view on that is if we remain in our silos shouting out and essentially talking to each other, then you don't shift an agenda going forward. And when I talk about the policy arena, unless you incorporate in that some appreciation and understanding of the fundamentals of financial and economic realities, then you will fail. And I think at the moment, one of the reasons this agenda is struggling to a little degree, and we have to respond to that, is that it has been framed as a zero-sum choice between either you have a so-called climate neutral or green choice, or you have economic growth, but you can't have both. That is a false dichotomy. And the now Prime Minister of Canada has made that case very strongly when he was at the Bank of England and continued to do so afterwards, Mark Carney. And I think we have to appreciate that health exists in a broader community, that actually economic growth in a sustainable way is actually also the only way ultimately we can pay for everything we want to pay out of the public purse, and that it is possible to do both. And in fact, the countries and the regions that manage to get into that future trajectory, frankly, and in a non-conflict way, will dominate the 21st century, because that is the only route to a sustainable economic model which embraces growth but puts it into a climate, the reality of the climate change that unfettered growth would severely damage. So I very strongly agree that clinicians cannot ignore the policy and the economic realities, and we need to embed ourselves in those debates and appreciate the interfaces that occur between them, and not have the arrogance of saying, we're just going to shout at you about the health agenda. If we don't accept that this also has an economic and a policy agenda, we will fail to make those arguments. And that interface and networking, I think, is absolutely critical. How we do that? I think we need to encourage clinicians, scientists, discovery, basic, translational, whatever we are or consider ourselves to be, to embrace that political and policy debate. And for mentors and sponsors and supervisors within the academic world to not somehow give an impression that unless you pursue a career as a PhD, MD, postdoc, whatever it might be, and stay within that environment, you've somehow failed. We need to encourage people to cross those divides, and the people that can bridge those divides in future with expertise in one area but willing to work with humility across that bridge, I think are going to be critical if we're going to solve these sorts of challenges.
Do we have, Mike Tipton.
Jeremy, thank you very much for your presentation. It's Mike Tipton, President-elect of the Physiological Society, that you know well. So one of the approaches, this conference is a policy conference which is made up of a lot of scientists and other groups. And you mentioned about people transitioning from science to policy. Is another approach to have scientists working closely with policymakers and informing each other? Because that's exactly the function of this particular conference. And it doesn't mean that a policymaker has to become a scientist or a scientist become a policymaker, but there is room for the two to work collaboratively.
There is, and actually, the UK has not a unique, but has an almost unique opportunity to do this, because whilst many of us over the last few years during COVID have been maybe a little bit critical of some things government did, nevertheless, the basic structure within the UK system of scientific advice into government, I think is certainly one of the great strengths of the UK, and actually one of the best structured way that science advice gets into government globally. The fact that you have a chief scientist in the UK, again, that's not unique. India has the same, for instance, and you have in almost every ministry, tragically, and I think wrongly, not in the Treasury, and I think that should be addressed, but you have a chief scientist in each ministry, effectively, who are then networked through the chief scientist. Now Angela McLean, it was Patrick Vallance until recently, is, I think, a great strength. What would be great to see is, now I can say this having left Wellcome, agencies such as the UKRI, Wellcome Trust, British Heart Foundation, Cancer Research UK, whoever they are, coming together and encouraging those interfaces with funding so that people in a scientific track or in a policy track can have interfaces early in a career, creating networks that would then last a whole career, and would improve the policy literacy of the scientific community and would improve the scientific literacy of the policy community. If we don't do this, these two communities and the diplomatic community will increasingly diverge. Science is moving at such a pace now, even as a scientist, it's very hard to keep up. Almost impossible for a policymaker or a diplomat to keep up. So bridging those two and putting them not to just have summits, and important as they are, but to actually embed them in the work you do every Monday afternoon and every Thursday morning is, I think, the best way forward. And the UK could lead the world on this because of its almost unique structure in terms of scientific advice into government and the great strength of its scientific ecosystem.
Thank you very much, and I think we will need to draw this to conclusion. I would like to say thank you to Jeremy. I would like to also say I think one of the really important things of this summit is it has brought together not just physiologists, it is really cross-disciplinary. We have clinicians here, we have people across the research field in very diverse areas of research. And more importantly, as Mike Tipton says, we have policymakers here as well. And I think we would all like to stay together as a network, and we would very much like to join with the EMBO network and see how we can work with the WHO, because I think we are going to do, as you said, together. It will take all of us to make a difference. So thank you very much for your time, and good luck.